So it seems as though the Middle East is once again exploding, whether it's Yemen or Israel or Gaza, doesn't matter. It seems like it's all somewhat going downhill. Well, let's take a closer look at the escalation between Israel and Hamas. Israel had two main goals throughout this campaign, which they've restarted. They've started the fighting once again. The first goal was to completely dismantle Hamas's military and government structure, and the second was to bring home the hostages that are still held in Gaza. Well, with the ceasefire now expired and negotiations failing, pressure from hardliners like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition pushed the Israeli Defense Force to restart military operations, launching major airstrikes in Gaza on March 18th. Shalom Lipner, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former advisor to multiple Israeli prime ministers, wasn't surprised by the strikes. They came after several attempts by President Donald Trump and his envoy Steve Witkoff to convince Hamas to extend the ceasefire. Hamas actually refused, likely because the hostages are its last bargaining chip in Gaza. Instead, the group wanted to move on to the next phase of negotiations. Both sides have already broken parts of the original agreement, Israel by restricting aid into Gaza and Hamas by staging public hostage displays, which were explicitly banned. So why did Israel decide to ramp up attacks again? Well, according to former U.S. Ambassador Gina Abercrombie-Whitstanley, Netanyahu made a calculated decision. Even though Hamas showed interest in further diplomacy, he chose to go back on the offensive. This suggests that getting the hostages home may no longer be the top priority for Netanyahu. Instead, he might be more focused on keeping the support of his right-wing coalition, which could help him deal with domestic issues like intelligence failures and ongoing legal battles. So how will Hamas respond? Well, Lipner expects the group, despite being weakened by months of Israeli attacks, to reorganize and try to ambush IDF troops if Israel launches a ground invasion again. So far, Israel has stuck to air and naval strikes to avoid risking its soldiers, but historically, Hamas has tried to draw Israeli forces into urban combat where it can inflict casualties and pressure the international community to demand a withdrawal. Abercrombie-Winstanley points out that Hamas is in a tough spot, though. Militarily, it's losing, and the world hasn't stepped in to stop Israel's attacks as expected. The group could choose to release hostages in exchange for safe passage into exile, but if Israel no longer sees hostages as a priority, Hamas may have little reason to keep them alive, and the fact that other countries really don't want Hamas moving into their countries either puts them in a difficult situation. So what does it mean for the civilians in this war? Well, the grim reality is Hamas still is holding hostages, and Israel's military strikes continue to kill civilians, including children, and people in Gaza have no safe place to go because Hamas occupies everywhere. Meanwhile, Arab states have offered little more than statements. None have pressured Hamas to leave Gaza, even though that has been proposed as part of a long-term solution. Without a clear path forward, both Israelis and Palestinians remain trapped in a cycle of violence. So what is the U.S.'s stance here? Well, the Trump administration has backed Israel's latest strike, signaling a preference for military action over drawn-out diplomacy. This stance allows the U.S. to brush off international calls for restraint while reinforcing Trump's image as a strong leader and strengthening U.S.-Israel relations. Lipner notes that this fits into a broader strategy that includes recent U.S. attacks on Houthi targets in Yemen and tough rhetoric towards Iran. The White House blames Hamas for the ceasefire's collapse and sees Israel's offensive as a part of Trump's larger Middle East approach. So where does this all lead? And I will say this, predicting the outcome is difficult, but a few things are clear. Any real chance of rebuilding Gaza and helping civilians will require long-term security, which seems far out of reach right now. Recent Arab proposals for Gaza reconstruction just don't meet the mark because they don't address Hamas's role or security concerns. Israel is unlikely to completely eliminate Hamas as the group's ideology still has some support in Gaza. And while some Hamas leaders may consider exile, Netanyahu's far-right allies strongly oppose ending the war on those terms, which could destabilize his government. Hamas commanders in Gaza may also refuse, even if their political leaders in Doha support the idea. The most likely outcome then is a prolonged Israeli presence in Gaza, and there's no clear alternative here. There's no other security forces that can take control. The UN is keeping its hands generally off, and other Arab nations just aren't stepping up. One possible solution could be an Arab-led peacekeeping force under U.S. coordination, which has been similar to past multinational efforts, and this might reassure regional allies without requiring American troops on ground, but Israel's right-wing faction may resist, preferring to maintain direct control. And despite the fact that there's promises of no troops on ground, you can't really control things from afar, especially when it's a coalition of Arab allies. Of course, unexpected events could change everything. A major strike on Iran's nuclear program, political upheaval in Syria, Egypt opening the Rafah crossing for Gazans, or Israel successfully rescuing all remaining hostages, for instance. Those all could change the calculus on the battlefield. But for now, the renewed fighting puts hostages, civilians, soldiers, and aid workers at an even greater risk. The coming days and weeks are going to reveal whether this escalation brings a solution or just deeper chaos, and I tend to lead towards deeper chaos at this point.